Okay, in the first video we were looking at how to divide up one item among two people, and the divide and choose method was what we talked about. Now we're going to talk about three people, three parties, and this is not three or more. This actually only works for three people. So it's kind of specialized, and it's called the lone divider. The lone divider. By the way, it's also called somehow the Steinhaus proportionality procedure, named after the person who discovered it. Both names are used in the book, but we'll just call it the lone divider. And it's called the lone divider because of your three parties, there's going to be one person who kind of does the cutting, does the dividing. Okay, yeah. So here we go. So again, let's suppose we have a cake. We'll do a rectangular cake. All right. And the first person, who we will call Anne, divides it into three pieces. So I'll just make up the cut. So maybe she cuts it like that and like that. So we've got three pieces. 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Now, the other two people, Bob and Carla, what they do is they each declare which pieces they would be willing to take. So maybe Bob says, I would take 1 and I'd take 2, but I'm not going to take 3. I don't like that piece. And Carla says, I only want to take 2. I don't like 1 or 3. Okay, so let's just suppose that's what it comes out to be, just as an example. All right, well then, what you do is you give Bob and Carla pieces they want. Now, obviously, since both Bob and Carla want 2, but Carla doesn't want this one, the way to do it is you would give 2 to Carla and you would give 1 to Bob. And then Anne would, by default, get 3. So that's the basic idea. Something to say about this, notice that both Bob and Carla should pick 1. It's not possible for them to not like any of the pieces, right? Because, I mean, it all adds up to the whole thing anyway. So if they were hoping to get at least 1/3 of the cake, in their opinion, 1/3 of the cake, even if 2 of them were super small, well, that would just mean the third one is really big. Or if 2 are really terrible pieces, the third one would be a really great piece. It kind of has to be, because it all has to add up to the total 100% worth of the cake. So they're going to like, both Bob and Carla, each of them will like at least one of the pieces. They kind of have to, or that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is, we would assume that Bob and Carla aren't, they're trying to get the most, so they're not gonna pick one that's less than 1/3 of the value in their opinion, and so therefore we know for sure that Bob and Carla will get something that they think is at least 1/3 of the value. By the way, Anne, it is clearly in Anne's benefit to cut these three in as equal a way as possible, in her opinion, because if she doesn't want to cut them unevenly, or she might get stuck with a bad piece. So she kind of has an incentive to cut them in pieces that she thinks is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? So she also ends up with a piece that she thinks is 1/3. So everybody gets a piece that they think is at least 1/3. By the way, that means that this procedure is proportional. By the way, it is also Pareto. Now, there may be a problem with this that you have detected. What if let me just redraw that. What if Bob and Carla only pick one piece and it's the same piece? That is possible, right? So if Bob and Carla pick only one piece and it is the same one, so what we do then is we have a special rule. Anne picks one of the 2 other pieces. Doesn't matter, whichever one. So let's say Anne gets number 1. All right, then what we do is we put the other 2 pieces back together to make a whole. So the 2, 3 pieces back together. And now Anne's done. She's got her piece. And then these 2 pieces, Bob and Carla can divide it between two, and we can just use divide and choose. We can use that earlier method that is for two people, which we're happy with. So we do divide and choose between Bob and Carla. And again, if you think through the strategy and if you think through everything, if you think through what people would do, this again is going to ensure that everybody will get 1/3 in their own opinion, in their own estimation. Everybody will get at least 1/3 of the cake. Anne will, because she is getting one of her pieces that she cut, right? And so presumably she was playing it safe and did 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and therefore got a piece that she thinks is worth 1/3. Bob and Carla didn't pick this one, right? So they thought this was less than 1/3, presumably, so that's why they didn't pick it. So that means they think that the remainder is at least 2/3, in fact more than 2/3 of the cake. And they're going to split it between them, and they're going to do it evenly, fairly, using divide and choose. So they're each going to get more. They're going to get something that they think is more than 1/3 each, because they think the whole thing is more than 2/3 of the cake. Okay, it's one of those things where you can hear me say the words, if but you kind of have to really just think about it and play it through in your head and convince yourself that it works. Okay, so as I said, it is proportional. Everybody does end up getting at least 1/3. It is Pareto. I didn't write that down, but it is Pareto. It turns out that it is not envy-free. There are situations, I'm not saying all the time, but there are situations where when it's all said and done and everybody looks at what everybody got, there may be somebody who would, wants to have what the other person has, would rather switch with somebody. So we can't rule that out. Okay, so that's the lone divider method. One more method, and now this one will work for 3 or more parties. And it's called the last diminisher. Now it works for 3 or more. I'm going to explain it for 4 people, but once you see how it works, you can see, oh yeah, it would work for 3, it would work for 5, etc. It's a very different method of doing it. It's called the last diminisher. So here's how it works. So we have our cake. All right. And we're going to have Anne, Bob, Carla, and Dave are going to be our 4 parties, our 4 people. So Anne cuts a piece that she thinks is 1/4. So she goes along and she cuts a piece that she believes is 1/4 in her opinion. Now, Bob can either leave that as it is if he thinks it's 1/4 or even less. If he thinks it's more than 1/4, he can make it smaller. He can cut it maybe a little bit smaller, right? Okay. Same thing with Carla. She can either leave it as it is or she can make it smaller. If she thinks that it's still actually more than 1/4, she can make it smaller to something that she thinks is 1/4. And again, and then finally for Dave, he can, if he chooses, if he thinks it's more than 1/4, he can cut it one more time, right? And again, remember, this is clearly less than 1/4 in terms of size, but maybe it's got those corners, and maybe Dave likes the corners, so he cuts it like that. And then whoever was the last person to cut it gets it. All right, so if Anne cuts it, and then let's say Bob cut it, Carla left it alone, and then Dave cut it, well then Dave would get that piece. Now if you think about it, Dave will definitely get, since he cut it, then he brought it down to 1/4, or yeah, he brought it down to 1/4, or at least he didn't bring it down to less than 1/4. So we know Dave's getting a piece that he thinks is at least 1/4, which would be his fair share in this case. And if it wasn't Dave, if Dave left it alone, but say Anne cut it and everybody else left it alone, then Anne would get the piece, and that would be fine because Anne would have thought it was 1/4. Now what's important to realize is that, so let's say Dave gets that piece, as I described in my first explanation. Dave gets that piece. Now so Ann, Bob, and Carla, they all think that that piece was not more than 1/4. Maybe 1/4, but maybe less. They all, for their opinion, they all think that that was 1/4 or less. Right? So Ann, Bob, Carla think it was less than or equal to 1/4. Right? Because they all had a chance to cut it down to 1/4 in their opinion. And then Dave cut it even a little bit more, so they all think Dave actually went a little bit below 1/4. Now Dave doesn't think that. He's good. He's happy with what he got. He thinks he got 1/4, but the others think it's maybe a little bit less than 1/4, which is good because now that means the remainder is more than 3/4 for Ann, Bob, and Carla, who are still in the game. Now, what you do then is you just do it again, but now with 3 people. So Dave's done, he's out, he's got his piece, and he's happy over on the side eating. Now Ann, Bob, and Carla restart it, and now you do 1/3. Ann cuts a piece that she thinks is 1/3. And then Bob has a chance. If he thinks it's more than 1/3, he can make it smaller. Carla, if she thinks it's more than 1/3, she can make it smaller. Whoever makes the last cut gets it. And all the thought process that I just went through for Dave will apply again. And so let's say Bob gets that piece. And again, Ann and Carla think that what's left is less than a half. More than a half. They think the 2 pieces that are gone are less than a half, and they think the piece that is left is more than a half. So they're still happy. All right, and then you do it again. And actually, when you get down to 2, you don't do this again. When you get down to 2, you just do divide and choose, because that really works when you're down to 2. Okay, so that's the last diminisher procedure. It's the most complicated, I think, to think through the logic of why it works. Okay, but it does. It turns out that it does work, and it turns out that it is proportional, but it's still not envy-free. It is Pareto. Not equitable, by the way. None of these are equitable. It's Pareto, proportional, but it is still not envy-free. You could end up at the end where one person would like to have what another person got. Okay. There are more procedures. There are a lot of different procedures that people have come up with. There are, in fact, some envy-free ways of doing it as well, but they get a little bit more complicated in order to achieve that. And so we are just going to leave it here. I wanted to just give you a feel for different ways of dividing a single item up among people, different ways to do it. Oh, one last thing I want to say, which is if this was really one thing that might have bothered you in the last 2 methods is, so for example, in Lone Divider, when I said in the one situation where you put the 2 pieces back together, or in this case where one person cuts and then another person can make it smaller, which of course means that the little sliver that got cut off sort of gets melded back with the big piece. And that might have seemed like, well, you're ruining the cake now, right? So I know I said as we're doing these cuts, but really, if you think about it, you can imagine somebody just taking the knife and maybe just putting like a little line in the frosting on top of where they would cut it, but they don't actually have to do the cutting. So I don't want you to get hung up on the fact that we're cutting and then putting stuff back together. We don't really have to do the cutting until the very end. So we don't have to make a mess of the cake, and so it still works. Okay, so we'll stop there with these procedures.